sisters and brothers of Tau B'Nai Sigma. This is Jonathan Markowski, National President, and I have a special guest with me this time for the 8 to 5 minute. So allow me to introduce Kathy Godwin, our chair of the Tau B'Nai Sigma Board of Trustees, who is also a past national president of the sorority. And we are here this month to talk about the Board of Trustees and the National Council, because we do have a solicitation for applications that is outstanding. So those applications are due January 15th to me. And you can find out more information about what should be included in the packet on our Facebook page, on our tbsigma.org page. I'm sure it's been posted also in the TBS Tuesdays and other places. But Kathy is here to talk a little bit about some of so that we can compare and contrast some of the pieces of the board and the council, so that you as students and potentially as candidates can understand the differences between those roles and know what we're looking for and what's appropriate and how this whole thing works. And so hopefully we can shed some light on that. So to start off, Kathy, if you would, can you tell us a little bit about just what a person on the Board of Trustees does?
Sure, I'll do my best. So a little bit about the Board of Trustees. We are not as involved, and I know Jonathan will talk about this shortly, we're not as involved in the day-to-day chapter operations issues of the sorority. The Board of Trustees is more thinking long-term about the organization for our financial planning and security. So we are involved in looking at our investments, doing donation fundraising so that we can ensure that we have a decent amount of funds should the sorority need it for anything unfortunate happening, or should the sorority decide it needs to move forward in a new direction, we have a pool of funds available for us to move forward. So a lot of what the board does is reviews where the organization is at and where it needs to be, and just make sure that we're secure. Individual members might be responsible for directly communicating with some past national presidents to ensure that we keep that line open, or looking at those capital development campaigns, or directly responsible for the investments. Right now, we're also responsible for a couple of scholarships, so that is another area. And we also have liaisons that are in touch with the TBSAA, along with the National Council, so that we're involved. We kind of stay in our lane so that we know what's happening, but it's not directly our responsibility to control those areas. Does that kind of explain it a little bit for you, Jonathan? Hopefully that helps.
It does for me, of course. You know, as the national president, I do also sit on the Board of Trustees. So in this role, I'm kind of, bridging the gap, but certainly I do have the privilege of seeing kind of both roles and being involved with both organizations.
And I actually have the same role, because as chair of the Board of Trustees, I am the liaison with the National Council. So I'm sitting in on National Council meetings, and both the on-the-phone versions or online versions, as well as in-person versions.
Right, and so that's why I'm so happy that you could be with us today, because it's the two of us in every meeting all the time.
All of the time.
Right?
Yes.
But so, yes, the board is clearly different in that sense, that the National Council, and students generally see a little bit more of the National Council, or the National Council is a bit more visible, I guess, in some ways, that the National Council is overseeing the day-to-day operations, the operating budget, whereas the board is overseeing the long-term budget or the long-term assets of the sorority.
Correct. Yes.
From a National Council perspective, clearly we have more individualized offices: president, vice president for colonization and membership, vice president for special projects, vice president for communication and recognition, each of those with their individual roles, and then the appointed vice president for professional relations. So if you're running for National Council, or if you're considering National Council candidates, you're really considering them for a very specific position with a specific duties, whereas trustees,
I think we're a little bit less so. It really is more that we're looking for You don't have to have held a national office to be on the board of trustees. You don't have to have held a district office. We're actually looking for what is your understanding of, do you have an understanding of like financial investments? Do you have an understanding of some strategic planning work so you can look further ahead? What areas of your knowledge might be beneficial in more of a background advisory type role should the National Council need it. For instance, occasionally I'm asked questions about risk management, but that's an area that the board is concerned about because assets, insurance, and the like. But it's not something that's a specific office. So it's having skill sets that fit with having a good business acumen and be able to think through what we need to do as a whole picture, because just as you said, it's day to day. Even National Council meetings happen more often than Board of Trustees meetings. You know, we meet every 6 weeks. We meet online. Our meetings are about an hour. We occasionally meet in person, but we're not running for an office when you're running for the Board of Trustees. You're running to be somebody who is the foundation to make sure that we're here into the future. Not that the National Council does not. The National Council does. But on a day-to-day basis, the National Council is thinking about it like this chapter needs X, this chapter needs Y. The Board of Trustees is more thinking Tau Beta Sigma as a corporation, as an organization. What does it need? Where are we at? Are we in a sound place? So that's why we don't need someone for a specific office. We need skill sets that are looking a little bit more forward and foundationally.
Absolutely. And as far as the National Council is concerned, when we talk about skill sets, or as we were discussing a little bit earlier, Kathy, what should a person be prepared to learn? Because in any role, you're immediately going to be thrust into this situation where you're going to have to learn some things. So, whereas a council candidate, and typically that would mean vice president for communication and recognition. It might mean vice president for special projects, but the council is built more from a, VPCR is the entry-level position in a sense, and it is built that you acquire knowledge to move to the next level along the way. That is what constitutionally, to be the vice president for colonization and membership, you must have been on the council before. Constitutionally, in order to be president, you must have been vice president for colonization and membership. So, whereas for Board of Trustees, there's no constitutional requirement necessarily for any other having held any office in TBS before.
Correct. Yes. So our board now does have some past national officers, some past national presidents, but in some cases, no. And that's actually can be beneficial. The skill sets that the individuals have are actually more important than their sorority experience necessarily. So if somebody has great experience already working with estate planning, or already working with capital development campaigns or donors in another nonprofit organization, or while they were going through their professional and personal lives, that's what we're looking for more so than you held this office, therefore you're qualified to be in this. So it's looking more for the individual skills. There are areas that you can learn. I would say that, not everyone needs to come onto the Board of Trustees understanding financial planning, but at least realizing that that's out there, and that we do have investments. And so we do look at the economy, and we do look at what's happening with stocks or bonds. And so to have that understanding is very helpful. The sorority knowledge is more that you understand that we're doing it on behalf of Tau Beta Sigma. That's where the sorority knowledge comes into play, rather than I know this about this office. It's more, I choose to give my skills in these areas because of my support for Tau Beta Sigma. So I think that's a little bit where we run into a different.
Right. No, certainly for National Council, and I mean specifically for VPCR candidates, we're looking at people who often have held district office, but again, not a requirement, but for the most part, have been active members, have participated and understand what an active member experience is like. I would say from a council perspective, that's certainly more our purview in the sense of overseeing chapters, individual chapters, making sure that they are adhering to policies and procedures. A lot of the times that means paperwork, dues. It can involve, focus on 5 and sorority programming and really turning our ideals and seeing them in action at the chapter level. Whereas the board, in a sense, the council is driving the bus and the board's making sure we have gas money. Right.
That would be an excellent way to consider it, because it's not something that we are worried on a day-to-day basis of, did chapter X do this. I will say that the board is informed when there are chapters that are of issue. So when major risks happen, if chapters are consistently having problems, it does end up in our ears or on our desk, but it's not necessarily our problem to fix. It's more communication, as we should be aware. And the council might ask an individual on the board, but not necessarily the board themselves as an entity for how to deal with it, unless it's something that would be an issue that's detrimental to the sorority as a whole. And then that would be the case that the board is fully involved. But I would say usually if we hear about an issue, it's a pretty big issue.
Right. We're talking, the council would obviously also know about it, but the council's sometimes working with chapters to make their operations better. We have, big fundamental knowledge of chapter operations, whereas the board gets involved when we have a chapter that's really gone to a place where they've put the sorority at risk.
Correct. Yes. Okay. I think, the sorority at risk is kind of the way you should consider it. So when someone has gone to a level of hazing, harassment, other levels of risk that we can probably think of, when it's gotten to a level that we are now putting the sorority overall nationally at risk, that's usually when the board is aware. So sometimes you might find that a board member doesn't know that a certain chapter is having issues or something came up. It doesn't mean that they're ill-informed or that the National Council is keeping secrets. It's more like that's really not the role that the board is playing. The board can be involved, but that's really not the place.
Right. Just like we announce a lot of things and we like to announce good things, but we don't always like to advertise when things aren't going so great.
Correct. And the other thing is the board has an opportunity in some cases, and Jonathan, feel free to correct me if this changes, but the board sometimes does not get all the information, because should any appeals need to occur for any membership statuses or chapter statuses, leaving the board out of some of the information would mean that they would not have any bias going into any type of appeal process, should it need to go to the level of the board.
Absolutely, because the council, especially the vice president for colonization membership, is often intricately involved when a chapter issue occurs, or if there's a chapter that's done something that's violated some kind of procedure or policy, whatever, that's in trouble for something. The VPCM, the district counselors, perhaps some other appointed liaison, maybe a chapter visitation assistant, but there are individuals who would be directly working with those students to understand the situation, first of all, and then to move to a resolution. But if that resolution were to be contentious, we would want to make sure that there was a level of leadership that was segregated, in a sense, from the details so that they could look at it with fresh eyes.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
That's kind of how we treat the board. It's not often that we elevate something to the board for that type of decision or those eyes, but it's nice to have the ability to do that when the case comes.
Right.
But let's talk about time and travel commitments. So from a council perspective, I would say that we have there's a significant expectation when it comes to volunteering for a council position in terms of time and travel. It's not completely undoable, and all of those of us who do it still have our real jobs. And it is a volunteer position, so we do still maintain other careers, most of us. We also all have families and personal lives. Now, you might think that we're just TBS geeks, and we might fall into that category too, but it doesn't take up 100% of our time, but it certainly is a significant portion of time. One thing I would say to VPCR candidates that some of them might not think about is how much vacation time or personal time you actually have available to you in your career, because we do travel a bit. For the council, we meet monthly online, twice a year in person, and then we travel to usually 3 district conventions a year, plus national convention. And then, so we're traveling quite a bit, and then as VPCM and president, even a bit more often than that, sometimes representing the organization at other major conferences. So there is a bit of travel involved, and our meetings tend to be about 2 hours, 2 hours a month in front of the computer on the video chat meeting, then plus the prep time for reports and things like that. But I know the board is a little bit different. So let's speak.
Yes, so the board is a little bit different. A couple of things about, and I will mention the cost factor on the board side of things. So for the Board of Trustees, our meetings are typically every 6 weeks. That seems to work for us. And generally, and they are online, and generally we try to keep it to about an hour. Emails and correspondence happens in between if something is changing with an upcoming funding drive, or we have some questions about our investments. But in general, it's that every 6 weeks. As far as traveling to district conventions or to national convention, or even the winter meetings, the board actually takes on the costs themselves in many cases for the travel. There are a few exceptions, but in general, the board tries to take on all the costs of travel out of their own pocket. It's actually part of the service that we give. There are times that it's covered, but that's why you will not often see the entire board at your district convention, because it is a case of what board member lives in the area and has the time to travel. We have been more recently meeting face-to-face a couple of times in a year, usually once in the winter and once in the summer, for national convention, national convention, or to do it during the district leadership conference in the other summer. It helps us to do a little bit of face-to-face time. But our meetings are actually shorter, typically. Our business is not the same. Again, it's not every detailed portion of how a chapter in the organization is needing to run. So it's a little bit shorter. Even our meals, oftentimes we're paying for that ourselves. Every now and then it might be picked up, but that's something that's really important for board candidates to know, that a lot of your travel, including your hotel stays or your plane tickets, it's going to be out of your own pocket. And that does include the meals while you're there too. So if you're wondering why the board members also at McDonald's with the students, we're trying to be fiscally responsible too. So we're being smart about it. Our meetings are generally shorter though, because it's just not quite as much that's covered in as much detail. It just doesn't need to be covered in the same way. So, but board candidates should know that the travel is on your own. The sorority does not cover much or any, depending on what the event is for. Occasionally we are asked to help install a colony or visit a chapter in need. But I know for the upcoming district convention season, I'm all set and ready to go to the convention in the district I live in and pay for it on my own. So.
Right, unlike a council member who would typically be assigned to 3 district conventions, but the travel and the hotel stay, the airline ticket if necessary, the driving, the food while you're there would be covered by the sorority. So that is the benefit of being on the council, is that your travel on behalf of the organization is covered.
But you have a little bit more to do. So a board member,
yes, but while you're there,
member might go to 1 district convention, whereas a council member might go to 3.
Exactly.
And while that's fascinating and super fun to do, because it's amazing to see the students and see the alumni at those events, it's also very tiring, because board members, just like the council members, also have personal and professional lives. We don't get paid to do this. So finding the time to, take time off, be away from families, or be away from a job, that's something that does need to be taken into account.
Let's talk a little bit about constitutional requirements, because we touched on it earlier. So we talked about for the council, for the entry level, for the BPSP, VPCR positions, that there is no requirement to have been any other position before, but you do have to be at least 25 years old and be a life member of the organization. So for the board, it's a little bit different.
For the board, it's a little bit different. You need to be 30. And I apologize.
No, that's okay.
You need to be 30. You don't have to have held the offices before. You do need to be a life member. But you don't have to have held any offices before to be in any of the positions, including the chair or vice chair of the Board of Trustees. You don't have to have held any previous positions.
How do you get to be chair, Kathy?
How do you get to be chair? Well, the chair is voted upon by the members of the Board of Trustees. So a vote is taken by the voting members of the Board of Trustees. And then we also have a vice chair who would serve when the chair could not. So the voting members make that decision. And that typically happens right at National Convention. As soon as we are all elected, the new round is elected. And I guess I'm going to take a quick step back now that I said that. Our terms are actually 4-year terms. So we're not all up for re-election every National Convention, which means any new candidates coming on, there would be people that would be continuing to help kind of with some of the onboarding process. So you do have that. But at National Convention, as soon as the new people are in place, then we usually try to hold a meeting and elect a chair and a vice chair.
No, I think that's a really important thing, is that running for the board means you're running for a 4-year term. If you're running for the National Council, you're running for a 2-year, 1 biennium term.
Right.
So in some senses, that's kind of why we feel so busy, because we only get 2 years to do what we have to do, right?
Right. Yes.
And then we talked about the age difference. Of course, for both pieces, you'd need to be a life member of the organization.
Right. But you don't have to have held any offices in order to do it.
Right. And then talking about actually at National Convention and the election process and procedure, because that's probably the other big place that both students and candidates would see very different things happen. Of course, we're collecting applications for both at the same time right now, And over the course of the spring semester, there'll be opportunities. Some of the candidates will be physically present at some district conventions. So certainly, students will have the opportunity to meet people who have put their name thrown their name in the ring for either type of leadership role. But when we get to national convention, that's where things get a little bit different, because the National Council will be elected at the end of the convention. So that would be on Friday in 2019. And council candidates will meet with a nominations committee that's basically made up of students. It will have some advisors that are typically past national officers, but the committee itself will be of students. They will be of student delegates at the convention. National Council candidates will meet with students in specific caucuses that they'll be scheduled into during the convention. And then students will vote and elect a new National Council, all of the 4 elected positions, at the end of the convention on Friday. So the difference there being that the board elections will not happen on the last day. They actually happen on the first day, or very close to the beginning of the convention. Board members will not caucus. So that's why it's really important for us to get some of the information about board candidates out to students this spring, to make sure that students understand both what the board does and who the people are that are running. When we get to that, to our opening session, we'll have some time to introduce the candidates, and then depending upon how much time we have, opportunities for either question or answer or platforms or that kind of piece. But students will have the opportunity to meet and understand who people running are, certainly. We're still working on the National Convention schedule, of course, so that's why I say some of this does still have to remain a bit flexible. So, I can't guarantee that you're going to have 3 minutes to say this or 5 minutes to do this or whatever. Sure. But certainly, we'll make sure that students have the opportunity to understand what's happening, and that the candidates have the opportunity to speak and to be introduced, and sure that people understand where everybody's at and how this all works. And then hopefully we'll be able to have a full board, a new board. As Kathy said, well, you talked about how some board members are up for re-election and some are not. Sure. But can we talk about who makes up the entire Board of Trustees?
Who makes up the entire Board of Trustees? So I know we're recording this, so if I make any mistakes,
we can edit it right out.
We can edit it out. So we do have one life member of the Board of Trustees, Janet Westmiller. She is not a voting member, but I believe for anyone listening to this, the name should be familiar. If not, please do take a look at your Tau Beta Sigma history. But she's a life member.
The 6th national president.
So you might know her. So she's a life member of the Board of Trustees. She's a non-voting member, but she does attend many of our online meetings and tries to attend our in-person meetings when she can. The current national president is a member of the Board of Trustees. So right now, Jonathan is a member of the Board of Trustees, but is a non-voting member of the Board of Trustees. The past national president, so the immediate past national president, is a member of the Board of Trustees, and is a voting member. And then we have 6 other people who are on the Board of Trustees, and they're in alternating years. So 3 are considered each time for the election. So there should be 3 seats that are up for election this time. There's no guarantee. Some of the people that are currently on the board may continue, some may not. We also have term limits, so that board members can only serve 2 consecutive 4-year terms, and then they need to take a break. So I know in one case we have someone that will be done with their 2 consecutive 4-year terms at this coming convention, so they cannot rerun. So hopefully that explains a little bit. And since I mentioned that the current president and the immediate past national president are on the board, that's a little bit of how we keep the communication and understand kind of what's happening and have that context, so that there's a connection with what's happening, without getting into that day-to-day business and that work, by having those past national presidents. But those are the people that are elected. So it is 4-year terms, and the term limit of 2 consecutive 4-year terms. So we do alternate like that. It's 3 and 3 each time.
No, and you brought up term limits, and I wasn't even thinking we didn't talk about that for council, but there is a term limit. There's a 1-term limit on being president, and so I do not have the option. I'm sure that makes a lot of people sad, but I will not be rerunning for national president. I can't.
Right.
Constitutionally. Yes. I will automatically become the immediate past president and get 2 more years on the board as a voting member now.
Yes.
But I will. There is one candidate for national president, and that is the vice president for colonization and membership, and then which also has a term limit. So you can only be VPCM once, and then you can only be president once.
Sure.
And the 2 lower elected offices, the VPSP and the VPCR, they do have term limits of 2. You actually can rerun, but I guess I would say historically, most people do not spend more than 1 term in each of those offices. I can't off the top of my head think of anybody who's done.
I can think of one time, but that was many, many years ago. And if they're listening, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make you feel old.
Sorry, and I'm sorry that I forgot whoever it was. So,
no, it's okay.
So fair
it was quite a while ago, and in sorority history, in comparison to, we will say, the age of the students that are listening to this today. So
right, probably, yeah. So we expect a little bit more motion, I guess.
Yes,
from
that
the
would
council.
be more as what's happening, and yes, and I'm not a recent past national president, so I might date myself by saying, yes, I do know, but yeah.
That's okay.
That's okay.
So I think that we have covered a lot about the National Council and Board of Trustees.
Excellent.
Is there anything else that you would like to add?
I think, like, really the only other thing that I would like to mention is it's just a little bit on funding, because it does come up.
Sure.
Like, where do these funds come from, or how does it happen? So your funds do come from dues.
Right. We manage the operational budget, which is basically everything that comes in during the year and everything that gets spent out during the year. And that is mostly student dues.
Mostly student
and late
dues.
fees.
and late fees. Yeah. There are other ways that a little bit extra might come in. So the Board of Trustees is not running on the same thing. And we don't have necessarily dues that we're taking in the same way. So what we truly are doing is seeking donations. We do receive some funding from life memberships, but there's also funding that the National Council receives from that. But most of what we're doing as far as funding is not to fund ourselves to operate the sorority. It's to fund to keep things going forward into the future, and is done by having development drives to raise funds, cultivating donors, and discussing estate planning. So it's a little bit different as far as the funding goes. So that's another thing that just want to make sure that people understand that difference. And again, why we are not as day-to-day from the board perspective. We are much more long-term, talking to people, building over a long time, rather than that day-to-day portion of things. So just to make sure that that's clear for everybody that's thinking about it.
Absolutely. I think that's a good point, even to talk about from an operational perspective, where we're talking about student dues. The National Council is very cognizant of where our money comes from, and although we do use it, certainly, when we do travel. We do that in the best interest of students. We are very concerned with the active membership experience and what occurs on campuses at chapters to make sure that the sorority is functioning and meeting its mission in a day-to-day operational way.
Right.
Whereas the board makes sure that we're meeting our mission from a step back, big picture.
Correct.
Is this how the organization is intended to, are we doing what we're supposed to be doing or what we say we want to do? Are we who we are,
Yes. Are we who we are? And if we're not, then is it time we are often the ones that will ask those questions too of, are we off track? Do we need to reconsider? Do we need to correct course? Because we are looking at it from a bigger, a wider view.
Absolutely.
And I think the other thing to just point out to make your life easier and hopefully the students as well, you mentioned how we will have a board, hopefully on day one of the National Convention. We hope so. So that's, and you mentioned that the board candidates will not be caucusing. But hopefully students and alumni listening to this will understand a bit more about why that's not something that would happen after listening to the differences between the two. Board candidates, you're going to get into a situation where you're talking about financial investments. That's not something that a late night caucus is necessarily the time to be able to explain, here's how we look at an investment portfolio. So that hopefully makes a little bit more sense as to why the National Council would be reviewing some of the candidates beforehand, and the caucuses would maybe not be the right kind of place for that. It is not that the board is unconcerned about what the students think. I mean, we very much so are concerned about what happens to students in this organization, but the candidates that are running, it's a different type of job. So it's a different type of how the candidates are selected.
Absolutely. And I touched on that the National Council has a nominations committee that's made up of students, but I forgot to mention that the Board of Trustees has a nominations committee that's made up of the current National Council. So the current National Council actually serves as the nominations committee for the Board of Trustees. So we'll be interviewing board candidates and spending some time with them and asking them some other questions that are very directly related to the board work and developing what we call a slate, but a suggested list of nominations to the students. Now, it is true, both the board, the trustees, and the National Council members will be elected by students. It's just that because of the different roles, there's a different group that is selected to provide a little bit of insight and give a little bit of guidance to who might be the best people to choose. But at the end of the day, it is still a student decision about who becomes a trustee or who becomes a National Council member. And that is the same for both. Yes. That brings me kind of to my closing or final piece that I would say about both the Board of Trustees and the National Council is that at the end of the day, we are all members of Tau Beta Sigma, sisters, brothers, what have you. We all love the sorority. We have its best interests at heart. We all give of our time and sometimes of our wallet, but we all should be capable of representing the sorority in normal course of business. We're all professionals. We're all adults, some of us adultier than others, but we have to be the adults in the room, and especially when it comes to working with students, and not to refer to students as kids, but because we are a group of adults, we have to be the adults among the adults, and those are things that I trust every board and council member to do, and that level of professionalism is certainly something that we look for in either board or council candidates. But we all have the sorority's best interest at heart, and I would leave it at that.
Excellent. I agree with you. I really appreciate that we had time to do this, And if anyone has questions, I know both you and I are available if anyone has questions.
Absolutely.
Running for office or how people are elected or anything else.
Kathy's email is a lot shorter than mine.
A lot shorter.
At tbsigma.org addresses. Mine is my full name, Jonathan Markowski, spelled all the way out. Kathy uses her initials, so you can get her at KEG. But of course, you can always send questions to tbs at tbsigma.org, and that's usually the fastest and easiest way for us to see and respond to anything, any questions that you might have or any concerns. Certainly, we'll post this in all of our usual places, and make sure that if any comments or anything else comes up, we can certainly do a part 2. I hope that Kathy has been such a wonderful guest that I'm sure that if I ask her real nice that she'd come back and join us again on another day.
I would be happy to, Jonathan.
I appreciate that. But otherwise, I'm gonna just I'm gonna say that this has been more of an 8 and less of a 5. But this has been a great 8 to 5 minute